Dr. Maya Richardson checked her watch for the third time as she walked through the gleaming halls of a light private aviation terminal. The clicking of her heels echoed against the marble floors as she pulled her small carry-on suitcase, its wheels rolling smoothly behind her. She was running perfectly on time for her chartered flight to the International Medical Conference in Boston, where she was scheduled to give a keynote speech about her groundbreaking work in pediatric neurosurgery. The terminal was quiet that morning, with only a few other passengers scattered around the luxurious waiting area. Some sat in plush leather chairs, typing on laptops or scrolling through phones. Maya adjusted her cream-colored blazer and checked her booking confirmation one more time on her phone, even though she had already memorized all the details. As she approached the security checkpoint, she noticed how the guard, a middle-aged man with graying temples and a stern expression, was handling the other passengers. He gave quick nods to most of them, barely glancing at their documentation before waving them through with a polite smile. His name tag read Thomas Wells in bold letters against the dark blue of his uniform. Maya prepared her ID and booking confirmation, holding them out professionally as she reached the checkpoint. The smile that had been present on Wells' face just moments ago disappeared, replaced by a look of suspicion that made Maya's stomach tighten. She had seen that look before, but it still stung every time. "Excuse me, ma'am," Wells said, his voice carrying a tone that wasn't present when he spoke to the previous passengers. "This is the private aviation terminal. The main terminal is in the next building." Maya kept her voice steady and professional. "Yes, I know. I have a chartered flight scheduled." She held out her documentation again. "Here's my booking confirmation and ID." Wells took the papers but didn't look at them immediately. Instead, he looked past her, as if expecting someone else to appear. "And who are you flying with today?" "I'm traveling alone," Maya replied, maintaining eye contact. "I'm headed to Boston for a medical conference." A businessman in an expensive suit walked up behind Maya. Wells immediately smiled at him over her shoulder. "Just one moment, sir. I'll be right with you." Turning back to Maya, his expression hardened again. "You say this is your flight booking?" He finally looked at the papers, studying them with exaggerated scrutiny. "These could be easily printed. Where's your pilot?" "Usually, private passengers are escorted by their pilots or staff." Maya took a deep breath, reminding herself of similar situations she had handled throughout her career. "The pilot is already at the aircraft, preparing for departure. You can call Elite Aviation's desk to confirm my booking. The reservation is under Dr. Maya Richardson." "Doctor?" Wells raised his eyebrows, making no attempt to hide his disbelief. "And what kind of doctor would that be?" The businessman behind Maya shifted uncomfortably, seeming to recognize what was happening. A young woman at the nearby coffee counter had stopped wiping the surface, her eyes darting between Maya and the guard. "I'm a neurosurgeon at Metropolitan Hospital," Maya stated firmly. "Now, would you please verify my documentation so I can proceed to my flight? I have a schedule to maintain." Wells picked up his phone, but instead of calling the aviation desk, he pressed a different button. "Security, I need additional verification at checkpoint 3. I have a situation here." Maya felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment but from controlled anger. She pulled out her phone and began recording, making sure to hold it steady and visible. "I'm documenting this interaction," she announced clearly. "I provided all required documentation, which you haven't properly reviewed. I'm a paying client of Elite Aviation, and your treatment of me has been notably different from other passengers." The terminal manager, an Asian woman in a sharp business suit, was already walking briskly toward them, having noticed the developing situation. Behind her, two more security officers approached, their expressions professional and neutral. Wells straightened his uniform, suddenly looking less sure of himself as he noticed the growing attention. The terminal manager's heels clicked purposefully against the floor as she got closer, her face showing she had seen enough to understand what was happening. Maya stood her ground, her phone still recording, her expression composed but determined. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her to stay calm in the face of adversity. This was far from the first time she had faced such prejudice, and while it was disheartening, she knew exactly how to handle it with dignity and purpose. Sarah Chen, the terminal manager, had seen enough situations in her 15 years of aviation management to know exactly what was happening. As she approached the security checkpoint, her face showed a mix of concern and determination, She had been watching the interaction on the security cameras from her office, and the difference in Wells' behavior between passengers was unmistakable. "Good morning, I'm Sarah Chen, the terminal manager," she announced as she reached the group. "Dr. Richardson, I believe you have a flight scheduled to Boston this morning." Her tone was professional but warm, a sharp contrast to Wells' previous attitude. Maya nodded, still holding her phone steady. "Yes, scheduled for 9:30 a.m. I've been trying to show Mr. Wells my documentation for the past 10 minutes." The two additional security officers stood quietly nearby, their presence adding a layer of official observation to the scene. Other passengers had stopped pretending not to watch, and the terminal's usual quiet buzz had dropped to a tense silence. "Mr. Wells," Sarah turned to the guard, her voice firm but controlled, "please explain why you called for additional security when Dr. Richardson has provided proper documentation." Wells shifted his weight, his earlier confidence wavering under his supervisor's direct questioning. "I was just following protocol for suspicious documentation. We have to be thorough with security." "Suspicious documentation?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I've been watching the checkpoint footage. You've cleared 12 passengers in the last hour with far less scrutiny. Please hand me Dr. Richardson's documents." As Sarah reviewed the papers, the businessman who had been waiting stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Sarah. "I feel I should mention that I've been watching this entire interaction. The difference in treatment was obvious and completely unprofessional." A young flight attendant from Elite Aviation hurried over, her face showing concern. "Dr. Richardson," she called out. "The pilot sent me to check on you since you hadn't arrived at the aircraft. Is everything okay?" Sarah handed the documents back to Maya. "Everything is perfectly in order, Dr. Richardson. Please, Lisa here will escort you to your aircraft immediately." She turned to Wells, her expression stern. "Mr. Wells, please report to my office after your shift. We need to discuss this incident in detail." Maya took a deep breath, lowering her phone, but not stopping the recording yet. "Thank you, Ms. Chen, but I'd like to file a formal complaint before I leave. This kind of discrimination shouldn't be swept under the rug." "Of course," Sarah replied, pulling out her business card. "I'll email you the necessary forms right away, and I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind." The young flight attendant, Lisa, gently took Maya's carry-on. "Your pilot has already completed all pre-flight checks, Dr. Richardson. We can still make your scheduled departure time if we leave now." As Maya prepared to follow Lisa, Wells suddenly spoke up, his voice less confident than before. "Dr. Richardson, I was just doing my job." "No, Mr. Wells." Maya turned to face him directly. "Your job is to verify documentation and ensure security. Your job is not to make assumptions based on appearance or to treat passengers differently based on their race. What you did today wasn't security, it was prejudice." Several passengers nodded in agreement, and someone in the back of the terminal started clapping softly. Sarah quickly gestured for the other security officers to take over Wells' position at the checkpoint. As Lisa led Maya toward the private aircraft area, Sarah walked alongside them. "Dr. Richardson, I want you to know that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. We'll be reviewing all of Mr. Wells' shifts and speaking with other passengers who may have experienced similar treatment." Maya nodded, feeling both tired and determined. "Thank you, Ms. Chen. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for everyone who might come after me who maybe doesn't have the confidence or resources to stand up for themselves." They reached the door leading to the tarmac, where Maya could see her chartered jet waiting in the morning sun. Lisa swiped her security card to open the door, and the fresh air hit Maya's face. Despite the unpleasant start, she was still going to make it to her conference on time. More importantly, she had stood her ground and ensured that this incident wouldn't be ignored. The news of the incident spread through Elite Private Aviation like wildfire. By the time Thomas Wells' shift ended at 2 p.m., Sarah Chen had already received 12 emails from witnesses, including 3 from other passengers who had observed the entire interaction. She sat at her desk, reviewing the security footage for the third time that day. On her computer screen, she could clearly see Wells' different behavior patterns. The footage showed him spending an average of 30 seconds with white passengers, while minorities were held up for 3 to 5 minutes each. The evidence was undeniable. A knock on her office door made her look up. "Come in," she called, already knowing who it would be. Wells entered, his uniform slightly wrinkled from his 8-hour shift. The confidence he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by nervous energy as he sat down in front of Sarah's desk. "Mr. Wells," Sarah began, turning her monitor so he could see it. "I've spent the last few hours reviewing not just today's footage, but footage from your previous shifts as well. Would you like to explain what I'm seeing?" Wells shifted in his chair. "Ms. Chen, I was just being thorough with security protocols. You know how important safety is in private aviation." Sarah pressed a button on her keyboard, and the screen showed split footage. On one side, Wells quickly checking a white businessman's documents, and on the other, his lengthy interrogation of an Asian family from the previous week. "This isn't about security, Mr. Wells. This is about bias." Sarah pulled out a thick folder. "I've also received several emails today. After Dr. Richardson's incident, other passengers and staff members felt compelled to report similar experiences they've witnessed during your shifts. Meanwhile, 30,000 feet above them, Dr. Richardson sat in her comfortable private jet seat, typing out her formal complaint on her laptop. The flight attendant, Lisa, brought her a cup of green tea. "Dr. Richardson," Lisa said softly, "I just wanted you to know that many of us have noticed Mr. Wells' behavior before. We didn't have enough concrete evidence to report it. What you did today was really brave." Maya saved her document and looked up at Lisa. "Sometimes we have to stand up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. Thank you for your support back there." Back in Sarah's office, Wells was becoming defensive. "Are you suspending me? I have a family to support. I can't lose this job." "You're being placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full investigation," Sarah explained, her voice firm but not unkind. "During this time, you'll be required to attend our company's comprehensive bias training program. Your future at Elite Aviation will depend on both the investigation findings and your commitment to changing your behavior." She handed him an official letter. "This document outlines the terms of your administrative leave and the next steps. The company will also provide counseling resources if you wish to use them." As Wells left her office, Sarah picked up her phone to call the company's HR director. They needed to schedule an emergency staff meeting. This incident had revealed a gap in their training and reporting systems that needed to be addressed immediately. In another part of the terminal, the young woman who had been working at the coffee counter during the incident was telling her coworkers what she had witnessed. "The way Dr. Richardson handled it was amazing," she said. "She was so professional, but she didn't back down. It made me realize we can't just watch these things happen." By late afternoon, Elite Aviation's corporate office had been notified, and their PR team was preparing a statement about their commitment to inclusive service and zero tolerance for discrimination. They knew that addressing this incident properly wasn't just about handling one case of discrimination. It was about setting a standard for the entire private aviation industry. The video of the incident, which another passenger had recorded and shared with terminal management, was being reviewed by the company's training department. They already planned to use it, with faces blurred, as a teaching tool in future staff training sessions, showing both what went wrong and how management should respond. As the day drew to a close, Sarah Chen sent one final email, a company-wide message announcing mandatory sensitivity training for all security personnel, starting the following week. The incident had created waves, and those waves were about to bring some much-needed changes to Elite Aviation. A week after the incident, the investigation into Thomas Wells' conduct was in full swing. The conference room at Elite Aviation's headquarters had been transformed into a temporary investigation center, with 3 large screens mounted on the wall displaying security footage from the past 6 months. Jennifer Martinez, the lead investigator from corporate headquarters, sat with her team reviewing hours of footage. They had created a detailed spreadsheet tracking every interaction Wells had with passengers, noting the time spent checking documents, questions asked, and any additional security measures taken. "Look at this pattern." Jennifer pointed to the screen, speaking to her team. In the past month alone, Wells held up 28 minority passengers for extended questioning, but he barely glanced at the documents of other passengers. The door opened, and Sarah Chen walked in with a thick stack of papers. "We've received more complaints," she said, placing the documents on the table. "After word got out about our investigation, passengers from the past 3 months started coming forward." One of the investigators, David Thompson, picked up a complaint form. This one's from a famous basketball player who flew through here last month. Says Wells made him wait 45 minutes for extra security checks despite having all his documentation in order. As they worked, the office phone rang. Sarah answered it, then turned to the team. Dr. Richardson just landed after her conference. She's willing to come in tomorrow to give her official statement in person. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, the HR department was conducting interviews with other security staff who had worked alongside Wells. Lisa, the flight attendant who had helped Dr. Richardson, sat nervously in the interview room. "Had you noticed Mr. Wells' behavior before?" the HR manager asked, typing notes on her laptop. Lisa nodded. "Yes, but it was always subtle enough that we weren't sure. He would claim security protocols when questioned, and none of us wanted to make accusations without solid proof." Back in the investigation room, Jennifer's team had made another discovery. They found security footage showing Wells taking lunch breaks with a small group of guards, where he could be seen making inappropriate gestures and laughing while pointing at minority passengers. "This goes deeper than one person's bias," Jennifer said, rubbing her temples. "We have a culture problem that allowed this behavior to go unchecked for so long." Sarah agreed, pulling out her tablet to show a new email. "Corporate just approved my proposal for a complete overhaul of our security training program. We're also installing new monitoring systems that will track and flag any unusual patterns in passenger processing times." The investigation team worked late into the evening, building a comprehensive case. They created a timeline of incidents, collected statements from witnesses, and documented every piece of evidence carefully. Around 8 p.m., Jennifer received an unexpected email. It was from a former elite aviation employee who had quit 6 months ago. The subject line read, "Information about Thomas Wells." "Listen to this," Jennifer called to her tired team. "This former employee says she left because Wells had created a hostile work environment. She's willing to provide dates, times, and names of others who experienced similar issues." Sarah looked at the mounting evidence with a mix of determination and sadness. How did we miss this for so long? How many passengers suffered in silence? As they prepared to wrap up for the day, David pulled up one final piece of footage on the main screen. It showed Wells on his first day at Elite Aviation, 3 years ago. He had been different then, professional, treating everyone equally. "Something changed over time," David observed. "The question is, was it the environment that changed him, or did he change the environment?" Jennifer started packing up her files. "Tomorrow, we interview Wells himself. After seeing all this evidence, I'm curious to hear his explanation." Sarah nodded, looking at the wall of evidence they had collected. "Whatever his explanation is, one thing is clear. This investigation isn't just about one guard or one incident anymore. It's about making sure our entire system changes so this never happens again." As they left the building that evening, the weight of their responsibility sat heavily on their shoulders. The investigation had uncovered not just individual bias, but systemic issues that needed addressing. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, but for now, they had made significant progress in understanding the full scope of the problem. Thomas Wells sat alone in his living room, staring at the mandatory sensitivity training schedule he had received in his email. 2 weeks had passed since the incident with Dr. Richardson, and his world had completely changed. The TV played quietly in the background, but he wasn't really watching it. His wife, Susan, walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and sat down beside him. "The training starts tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," Thomas replied, his voice tired. 3 weeks of full-day sessions. He took a sip of coffee, remembering how his 12-year-old daughter had asked him at dinner why he wasn't going to work anymore. He hadn't known how to explain it to her. The previous day's interview with the investigation team kept replaying in his mind. They had shown him video after video of his interactions with passengers. Seeing his own behavior from an outside perspective had been eye-opening and uncomfortable. "I didn't realize," he said to Susan, breaking the silence. I didn't think I was." He struggled to find the words. "Racist." Susan finished his sentence. She had been direct with him since the incident, refusing to let him make excuses. "Tom, I've been trying to tell you for years that some of your jokes weren't really jokes." Thomas got up and walked to the window, watching their neighbor's kids playing basketball in the street. One of them was wearing a doctor's white coat from a Halloween costume. It reminded him of Dr. Richardson. His phone buzzed, a text from Mike, one of his coworkers who used to laugh at his jokes during lunch breaks. "Don't let them brainwash you in that training," the message read. Thomas stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Later that afternoon, Thomas drove to the local library. The sensitivity training program had sent out a recommended reading list, and he had decided to get started before the sessions began. As he walked through the doors, he saw a young black woman helping an elderly white man find a book. She was patient and kind, just doing her job, like he was supposed to have been doing his. "Can I help you find anything?" she asked as he approached the desk. "Yes," he replied, pulling out the reading list. "I'm looking for some books about unconscious bias and racial discrimination." The librarian, whose name tag read Joy, smiled and led him to the relevant section. "Are you taking a course?" she asked politely. Thomas hesitated before answering. "Kind of. It's training for work. I need to do better." Joy nodded, not pressing for details. She helped him find several books, including one written by a black female doctor about her experiences in the medical field. Thomas felt his chest tighten as he read the book's description. That evening, sitting in his favorite chair with one of the books open on his lap, Thomas found himself reading about microaggressions and systemic racism. He learned about how small actions and assumptions could build up over time, creating barriers and hurt that many people carried with them every day. His daughter Katie walked in, noticed what he was reading, and sat down nearby. "Dad, we learned about prejudice in school last week," she said suddenly. "Our teacher said sometimes people don't know they're being unfair until someone shows them." Thomas looked at his daughter, surprised by her wisdom. "Your teacher is right, sweetie. Sometimes we need someone to help us see what we're doing wrong so we can do better." Katie smiled and hugged him before leaving the room. Thomas returned to his reading, taking notes in a small notebook. Tomorrow would be his first day of training, and he was beginning to understand that it wasn't punishment, it was an opportunity to change. As he prepared for bed that night, Thomas looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. "You can't change the past," he told his reflection, "but you can learn from it." He thought about Dr. Richardson again, wondering if he would ever have the chance to apologize properly, not with excuses, but with real understanding of what he had done wrong. The large conference hall at the National Aviation Security Summit was packed with industry professionals. Dr. Maya Richardson stood at the podium, her presentation slides showing statistics about discrimination in private aviation. The incident at Elite Aviation had sparked a nationwide conversation, and she had been invited as the keynote speaker. "What happened to me wasn't unique," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "But what happened afterward was different. Elite Aviation chose to face the problem head-on instead of hiding it." In the audience, Sarah Chen sat with representatives from other aviation companies. She had brought along the new training materials that Elite Aviation had developed, which were already gaining attention from other companies. A slide appeared showing security checkpoint statistics from various private airports. "These numbers tell a story," Maya continued, pointing to the graphs. "Minority passengers face 3 times more random security checks than other passengers. The average wait time for document verification is 5 minutes longer." The audience murmured, many taking notes. Some looked uncomfortable, recognizing similar patterns at their own facilities. Others nodded in agreement, having witnessed such disparities themselves. In another part of the country, Thomas Wells' story had become a case study in bias training programs. He didn't know it, but a video interview about his journey to recognition and change was being shown in security training sessions across multiple airports. Back at the summit, Maya clicked to her next slide, but there's hope. In the 3 months since Elite Aviation implemented their new training program, incident reports of discriminatory behavior have dropped by 80%. Employee satisfaction has increased, and passenger complaints have decreased. Sarah felt a surge of pride. The changes hadn't been easy, but they were making a real difference. Her phone buzzed with a message. Another aviation company wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss implementing similar programs. During the lunch break, Maya found herself surrounded by aviation security directors eager to learn more. "Dr. Richardson," one of them said, "would you be willing to consult with our company? We need this kind of change." Meanwhile, local news stations had picked up the story. A reporter interviewed passengers at various private aviation terminals across the country. The responses were eye-opening. I used to dread flying private because of the extra scrutiny, said one successful black businessman. Hearing about what elite aviation is doing gives me hope that things can change. Social media was buzzing too. The hashtag aviation for all was trending, with people sharing their own experiences and calling for industry-wide reform. Aviation companies were being forced to examine their practices under the spotlight of public attention. Back at Elite Aviation, the effects were visible. New signs hung in the terminal: report discrimination. Your voice matters, with a QR code linking to an anonymous reporting system. Security guards went through weekly check-ins with supervisors, and passenger feedback was carefully monitored. Lisa, the flight attendant who had helped Maya during the incident, had been promoted to passenger relations coordinator. She was now responsible for ensuring all passengers felt welcome and respected. The best part, Lisa told a new employee during orientation, is that people feel comfortable speaking up now. They know they'll be heard and that action will be taken. At the summit, Maya concluded her speech with a powerful message. Change doesn't happen by itself. It happens when good people decide to do something about bad situations. It happens when companies choose accountability over convenience. It happens when we all work together. The applause was thunderous. As Maya stepped down from the podium, Sarah approached her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for turning a terrible experience into an opportunity for change." Maya smiled, remembering how different things had been just a few months ago. "Thank you for being willing to change," she replied. "That's what made the real difference." As the summit concluded, representatives from 20 different aviation companies had signed a pledge to implement similar training and monitoring programs. What had started as one incident was growing into an industry-wide movement for positive change. The meeting room at Elite Aviation felt different today. Sarah Chen had arranged it carefully: comfortable chairs, a round table instead of the usual rectangular one, and soft lighting that made the space feel less formal. On the table sat a pot of coffee and some water bottles, untouched. Thomas Wells sat nervously, his hands folded in front of him. He had completed his 3-week sensitivity training program, followed by 2 months of additional counseling and community service at a local minority youth center. The man who sat here today was noticeably different from the guard who had confronted Dr. Richardson 4 months ago. The door opened, and Sarah walked in with Dr. Maya Richardson. Maya wore a simple blue dress, her expression neutral but not unkind. Thomas stood up immediately, his heart racing. "Dr. Richardson," Sarah began, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting. As we discussed, Mr. Wells has requested this opportunity to speak with you." Maya sat down, placing her bag beside her chair. "Thank you for arranging this, Miss Chen." She turned to Thomas. "Mr. Wells, I understand you have something to say." Thomas took a deep breath, remembering what he had learned about taking responsibility without making excuses. "Dr. Richardson, I've spent the last 4 months learning about myself and my actions. What I did to you that day was wrong. Not just unprofessional, but deeply wrong on a human level." He pulled out a small notebook where he had written his thoughts. "I've learned that my behavior wasn't just about that one day. It was about years of unconscious bias that I never confronted. I hurt people, made them feel unwelcome and unsafe in spaces where they had every right to be." Maya listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. Thomas continued, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "At the youth center where I've been volunteering, I met a young girl who wants to be a doctor. She reminded me of my daughter, but she told me she's worried about how people will treat her because of her skin color. That hit me hard. I was part of the problem she's afraid of." Sarah watched the interaction carefully, ready to step in if needed, but both Maya and Thomas maintained their composure. "The training opened my eyes," Thomas said, "but it was the real-world experiences that changed my heart. I saw how my actions affected not just the people I discriminated against, but also their families, their children, their dreams." He paused, making eye contact with Maya. "I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I am truly, deeply sorry, and I'm committed to being part of the solution now." Maya was quiet for a moment, studying the man before her. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, so different from the hostility she had faced that day at the security checkpoint. "Mr. Wells," she finally spoke, "apologies are important, but actions matter more. Tell me what specific changes you've made in your life and work." Thomas nodded eagerly. I've started a support group for security personnel to discuss bias and share experiences. I've developed a training module based on my personal journey that's now part of the standard security training year, and I've been working with the Youth Center to create a mentorship program connecting aviation professionals with minority students interested in the field. Maya's expression softened slightly. Those are meaningful steps, Mr. Wells. Change isn't just about feeling bad about past actions, it's about actively working to create a better future. Sarah smiled quietly, seeing the tension in the room gradually dissolve. This was what real progress looked like, not just policies and procedures, but personal transformation and honest dialogue. Dr. Richardson, Thomas added, I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that you changed my life. Your courage in standing up that day didn't just expose my bias, it gave me the opportunity to become a better person. Maya reached for her water bottle, taking a small sip before responding. Mr. Wells, the hardest part of confronting bias is acknowledging it exists. You've done that, and you're working to change. That's all anyone can ask for. 1 year had passed since the incident that changed elite aviation. The terminal looked different now, more welcoming, with diverse faces featured in the artwork on the walls and multiple languages on the signs. But the real changes went much deeper than decoration. Thomas Wells stood at his new post as head of diversity and security training, watching a group of new security officers go through their orientation. His own experience had become a powerful teaching tool, and he could see the impact it had on the trainees' faces as they discussed real-world scenarios. Remember, he told the group, security isn't about assumptions or bias. It's about consistent, professional treatment of every passenger, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Across town, Dr. Maya Richardson was preparing for surgery at Metropolitan Hospital when her phone buzzed with a notification. The aviation industry newsletter had published their annual report. Elite Aviation's new policies had been adopted by over 200 private aviation companies nationwide. In the terminal's break room, Lisa, now the chief of passenger relations, was meeting with her team. Our satisfaction ratings have never been higher, she announced, showing them the latest statistics. And not just from minority passengers. Everyone feels more comfortable in an environment where they know fairness is a priority. Sarah Chen walked through the security checkpoint, now equipped with new technology that tracked processing times and flagged any unusual patterns. She smiled at the changes she saw. Diverse security teams, passengers moving smoothly through checkpoints, and a general atmosphere of respect and professionalism. Her phone rang. It was another aviation company CEO calling for advice on implementing similar changes. These calls had become regular over the past year, as Elite Aviation had become known as a leader in inclusive practices. Later that afternoon, a young black girl around 12 years old approached the security checkpoint with her parents. She wore a pilot's cap and carried a model airplane. The security officer, a former trainee of Thomas, smiled warmly and asked about her interest in aviation. I want to be a pilot, the girl said confidently. My mom says I can be anything I want. Thomas, observing from nearby, felt his heart warm. He remembered the days when such dreams might have been met with skepticism or worse. Now, he watched as the officer engaged with the family professionally and enthusiastically, making the young girl feel welcomed and encouraged. In her office, Sarah reviewed the latest quarterly report. Incident complaints had dropped to near zero, employee retention had improved by 60%, and their training program was being studied by aviation authorities as a model for industry-wide implementation. A notification popped up on her computer. Dr. Richardson had agreed to join Elite Aviation's newly formed advisory board for inclusive practices. The board would help guide policies not just for their company, but for the industry as a whole. Thomas's phone chimed with a message from his daughter Katie. She was doing a school project on positive social change and wanted to interview him about his experience. He smiled, grateful that his story of transformation could help others learn and grow. At the end of the day, as the sun set over the airport, a diverse group of passengers moved smoothly through the terminal. Among them was an elderly Asian couple being helped by a young black security officer, a Muslim family chatting comfortably with a white flight attendant, and a Hispanic businessman discussing flight plans with his pilot. Maya, passing through on her way to another medical conference, paused to observe the scene. She remembered the tension and fear from that day a year ago, and marveled at how one incident, handled properly, could spark such meaningful change. Thomas spotted her and gave a respectful nod, which she returned with a small smile. They both knew that while the incident that brought them together had been painful, the results had created a better future for countless others. As the last flights of the day departed, the terminal hummed with the energy of positive change, a living testament to the power of confronting bias, accepting responsibility, and working together to create lasting transformation. What had started as one woman's stand against discrimination had become a movement that would continue to grow and inspire for years to come.